anyway, just since we know we've got a problem, Eastern Oregon, with mule deer, I guess I would say if there's going to be another designated area where the cougar population should be controlled, it would be that area where we got the problem with the mule deer population. Okay, then I'll move next on the change on for blacktails in Western Oregon to visible antlers. I was kind of on the fence on this until I did talk to a couple of biologists, one retired, he's got boots on the ground, guys that spent a lot of time, I mean, probably at least, I don't know how many, 30 plus years of experience on the retired man, and I will say that both them supported, they said the biology supports, and they went through, they agreed with you on that, and I will say from personal experience in the Siletz area, LC stock units there, I have seen quite a bit in the past of, spikes killed accidentally, people coming from areas where they could hunt spikes, didn't realize it, didn't read the regs. I think some are killed by accident, guys looking through a scope and they see the horns, the head turns, and oh, it's a fork, and bang, and I think a lot of those get left in the field. So, I mean, I think there are quite a few problems with that too. So, I mean, I personally, after looking at both sides, I would support the change to the visible antler. And then getting to the damage tags, boy, I don't know where to go on that either. I was against it, and then I was for it, and then I'm kind of against it again. I'll tell you something. My experience, I had a Willamette unit tag any elk last year, and I had two pieces of property, one on the west side and one on the east side, where I had access to farmers, and the elk never crossed the border from those areas. And I found lots of other herds of elk that I could not get access to them. I'd ask the landowner, and they say, no, we're saving those for the kids, or we're doing this. So I mean, I couldn't find access to go after any elk that I didn't already have that prior permission to go to. And then I did notice where you have your it looks like you want to expand the boundary, the western boundary of that de-emphasized area. Is that right? For the Willamette unit?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Spelberg, so what you're referring to is in the Trask unit.
Yes.
We have a high damage area around the Patton Valley that we are proposing to include in that general season boundary. It would not be an expansion of the designated elk de-emphasis area in the Willamette unit.
And that was one of the areas I had access to. Cherry orchard, big cherry orchard, some of it on in the Willamette unit, some of it on the Trask side. Well, you know where the elk were the whole time. They spent the whole time on the Trask side and never moved over. And then I saw the same thing on the east side. There's gob elk just across that Staten Sublimity Highway, or Staten Silverton Highway. Victor Point, all that country up in there, a ton of elk. I was hoping some of them would move over into the area. I had permission, they never did either. But it seems like the agricultural ground on both sides there, east and west, have a lot of that elk in there that I'm sure probably some damage tags would be appropriate there. Anyway, I guess let someone else talk.
Commissioner Wall?
I have a couple questions, and the first one would be, and Nick, I have enormous sympathy for your response that said, what else would we do when we've been working on this for all of these months or even a year? But one point I heard during the discussion about the partnership and how do we make these things work better was, how will we know if it worked better next year if we don't have metrics? Could you just respond to that?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall. Yes, so metrics have come up specifically to the general elk season damage proposal, and that is one of the things that we brought up when we met with the Oregon Hunter Association board. That was a suggestion of OHA, is that we develop some metrics and some monitoring for that, and that's something we thought was a great idea and something we're definitely going to do. Do we have that right now? No, but we have talked about and have ideas of what data points we want to use to develop kind of criteria for success for that program. And honestly, we've just been preparing so much for being here today with the packet and presentation. We haven't gotten to putting pen to paper on that, but that's our next step with this. And then, so that's for the general elk season damage tag, but all of the hunts in general, like changes to controlled hunts, I think that is something we're really going to need to rely on our local staff. We put a lot of weight in our district biologists who are on the ground and out interacting with their hunters and working with their local chapters, and letting them judge, okay, how has this changed? You know, we moved this boundary over here, so it'd be easier for hunters to understand how has that change impacted hunters. Has it been a good thing? And we could come back and make some tweaks to that.
Let me just follow up one more time. Is that, the metrics itself, is that an issue ripe for like one session or a couple sessions to figure out? Because the three places where I believe I heard a strong interest in having work group efforts or some changes is in the black-tailed deer, because there are so many changes, the mule deer because it's in the population is in decline, and the damage hunts with elk, but you already dealt with the elk. So on the mule deer and on the black-tailed deer, if I were a regional person, I'm not sure I would know how to tell you if it went well or didn't go well unless somebody helps me put that together, or at least there's some agreement. So are those two other areas, blacktail and mule deer, ripe for a work group meeting or two to figure out what the metrics are? So if we're going to go ahead with all of these changes, we at least know what it looks like if it went well and what it looks like if it didn't. I'm just asking because the truth is it's a little hard to figure out a good path forward right now.
I see Tom reaching for his microphone. So we'll
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall. Yeah, we could certainly have a discussion about if there were additional metrics that somebody could think of that would be valuable. But we do have a mandatory reporting system for all deer tags. So we'll be tracking the harvest, the effort, we get up all of that. We get the point structure so we can see what proportion were spikes and so on. So we can, we collect a lot of that already. And one piece for those folks who choose to use the electronic tagging system, we also capture, the day of the season that they took that, which is something we don't always get for hunters with paper tags. And yeah, as Dawn mentioned, there's also the biological data that we would continue to collect, and not only the herd composition and trend counts that the district biologists do throughout the state, but Dr. Dwayne Jackson is still working on, the fecal DNA and other things, and hopefully expanding to new areas to gain more there.
Sure. Just in the interest of getting a bit of a proposal on the table, there are areas where we seem to have lots of agreement, and we don't even have to talk about them. The bear hunts and the squirrels and all of that stuff, we seem to have agreement. The two places where I would like to pose something, just to get something on the table that I was persuaded of through all of this, is not extending the elk hunt into that late season. And the other one was to have an advance purchase, at least 3 days. I don't know the exact number. I think nobody knows a magic number, but 0, just real time doesn't seem to work. So I would put 3 days on the table. And the third proposal I would make in the interest of getting something on the table is that we have a narrow scope additional discussion that to fix this, that's overstating it, to keep this partnership and figure out what the metrics are, if you will, on these big issues that we just talked about. And then we would have at least something to go forward with. So I would put that out for people to talk about.
Okay, so
Mr. Chair, I would just like to add that, as far as the, continuing to work on metrics in the coming months, we're all for that. I do want to make sure you're aware that we are talking about the 2020 regulations here, So we won't have any actual results until we start talking about, actually, it would be the 2022 regulations, because it will be post, anyway. So I just want to make sure we knew the timeline. But then the issue of the tag sale deadline, Mr. Steele mentioned it, but these are damage hunts on private lands where they have what I would call not chronic damage, they have acute damage. And having a tag sale deadline will entirely, or not entirely, but to a great degree defeat the purpose of this new approach to dealing with damage. So I guess I'll look to the staff to either tell me I'm all wrong or I'm all right, or something in between. But I really, just to give you an example, and we used to have a tag sale. We don't even have a tag sale deadline for general season tags right now. You can come to us after the season starts, fill out an affidavit that says you have not already harvested an animal, pay the $25 late fee, and buy a tag.
Mhm.
So to have a 3-day or some period tag sale deadline before a damage hunt is really, it's counterproductive.
Got it.
Yeah.
Chair Finley, Commissioner Wall, I would add just one comment to that. Within these proposed elk general season damaged areas, currently, much of the hunting that occurs in those is through the elk damage program, and those tags also have no sale deadline. An individual can convert it and walk right out the door to go hunting.
Commissioner Lampard.
So, Mr. Chair, no questions but comments, if that's okay? Is it, or do you want more questions?
No, you can mix them up.
Okay.
It
So,
may spur a question among one of us.
okay, well, I can go ahead and do my comments? Okay, so I'd like to read this because I was taking notes as we were going here, and I'd taken notes before that. So I'll read this in the record, and Michelle, I'll make sure you get a copy. So when I became a commissioner, I committed that I would explain the reason and rationale for the votes I take on important issues that come before this commission. That this agenda topic is an important issue. Today's big game seasons and regulations, as well as the initial components of the big game hunt review process, are important matters for many inside and outside of the hunting community. We need to encourage more folks to get into this great sport of hunting for all the reasons that people go hunting, and it's not just about harvesting an animal. First, let me say thanks to those of you who chose to travel to Gold Beach today and still stay here to provide your input, even late into the day. Much appreciated. I also appreciate the extensive public process that allowed anyone to comment on the proposed big game seasons and regulations. There were 20 public meetings held around the state where folks could show up and provide valuable and important feedback to the department staff on the proposed rules. Approximately 570 people attended those meetings to listen to staff proposals generated from the local districts up through staff and provide input to the department staff. I assure you, staff listened intently to your valuable input. Of course, many could not attend, but provided valuable input through emails, letters, and direct contact through your sports group association with staff. I've read all 161 letters, emails, and public input forms provided in our commission packets. Again, thank you for your valuable input. Thanks to those who took the time to drive to Gold Beach today and provide face-to-face testimony. Much appreciated. I also want to thank Kevin and Nick for sitting down with me for about 2 hours to answer the 2 pages of questions that I had regarding these proposals. Now for my comments on some specifics in the proposals. There were comments submitted about the start date for the pilot of the new general season elk damage tag. Specifically the start date of August 1st, which is the height of fire season and usually the hottest time of the year. And I was told, to my chagrin, the start date of August 1st is not a change. It's been that way for many years. Lots of input and comments and maybe some confusion on the piloting of the new proposal for the general season damage tag for 2020. Yes, this is a change, and change is somewhat difficult to try and accept. We are having some significant issues with elk damage on private lands who rely on their crops for their economic livelihood. The goal is to try this pilot project, this pilot effort, before migratory elk transition to the winter range or on or across many of these private lands. I support trying this approach as a pilot, with the goal of monitoring to see if it accomplishes what we hope. And if it does not, we can modify the pilot in 2021. In other words, I would hope that you give this pilot a chance. Thanks to the Oregon Cattlemen's Association, OFIC, and the Farm Bureau for giving the pilot program a chance. If it does not work, maybe we can explore the trap and transplant option or other options that were talked about today. Lots of input regarding deer numbers. In terms of blacktail numbers, all but one wildlife management unit has met or exceeded buck ratios in 2 of the last 3 years. Very good point from OHA, though, from their testimony, and you are correct. In most of Eastern Oregon units, mule deer are declining, and that is deplorable. Unfortunately, this is not only an Oregon problem, but a problem across the western U.S. And if you look at the numbers in other states, they're having the same problems we are. We need to aggressively work this issue to return our deer numbers to historic levels, and there are efforts in the works to do just that. Our proposed regulations for this next year help us to get there by reducing harvest tag numbers by over 1,400 tags proposed for 2020. I agree with the OHA testimony that much work in returning mule deer numbers throughout Eastern Oregon needs to happen. We need OHA, who is a key constituent and a valued partner, and others who testified today to stay engaged with us, even though some of your suggestions may not have been adopted at this time. I was particularly taken back by the comments regarding our vets and the department's proposal to no longer allow non-resident vets hunting by paying resident fees. In talking to staff, our attorney has informed the department that we have been interpreting the statute wrong, and we need to comply with what the statute says, which means non-resident vets will need to pay non-resident rates. If this is an issue that should be addressed, it needs to be addressed in the next legislative session because that is in statute. Quite a bit of public input on the proposal to move from forked horn to the visible antler. Some favor, some don't. I believe staff has addressed the need for this proposal, and I support the change. Several inputs from the traditional bow hunters regarding the size of the units and the duration of the seasons. After reviewing the information provided, I support staff's proposal and believes it gives the traditional bow hunters a fair and equitable area to hunt, as well as a fair time period to hunt. Thanks for your support of the North Fork of John Day Wilderness expansion. I realize you did not get all you asked for. In summary, I want to thank staff for their efforts to craft proposals for the seasons, regs, and efficiencies proposed for the regulations. Lots of work. And while it's likely not perfect, and we know it's not perfect, to some in this room, and maybe even to some commissioners who've provided input and who listened, we all listened, and I'm going to support those recommendations. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Woolley.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So could you tell me more about your thinking and reasoning and your decision-making process about combining the compound bows with traditional bows in the specific areas? In some areas you're proposing combining. You want to create a new traditional only area, which is great, and I think there have also been some elimination of some traditional areas. And so, as you know, as a commission, we've talked a lot about compound bows versus traditional bows. And I guess there was a field day a few years ago, where some commissioners had the opportunity to shoot a compound bow, and a lot of the consensus was that it felt more like a rifle. And I wasn't at that field day, but I've been at a regular archery range, shooting a traditional bow next to someone with a compound bow, and it was load, aim, shoot, bullseye. Load, aim, shoot, bullseye. It was over and over and over and over again. And, I'm shooting all over the place, right? So, I mean, I feel that the traditional areas should stay, that exist should be intact as they are, without that competition from the compound bow. But I would like to kind of have a better understanding of your reasoning of why you, and I, you know, again, with these discussions we've had, we've talked about, you know, some seniors or differently abled people that, you know, have more success, you know, if they're able to shoot a compound bow, they don't need the upper body strength and that sort of thing. So I understand that as well. But you know, I just want to have a better sense of how you thought through this in your reasoning with this sort of reorganization of hunting tools in these different units.
Chair Finley, Commissioner Woolley. So our team that worked on this obviously has had a lot of discussion over the last year about traditional archery, and some of our discussion and the approach that we took. Talked a lot about the, you know, archery hunters have a lot of opportunity in the state. We have general seasons that cover almost the whole state, and what we talked about is that it really gives the hunters the opportunity to decide what they want to choose as a weapon type. So they can, in those seasons, they can choose whether they want to use a compound bow or whether they prefer to use the traditional archery equipment. That was one discussion. The other was that, you know, there has been a lot of interest from the group for more traditional only archer equipment when they can hunt without other archers. So we did want to provide some of that opportunity, and that's why we're proposing some new controlled traditional archery hunts to provide them with that opportunity. But also one of our priorities was addressing the complexity in our current general season that's created by Canyon Creek, because our general season hunting opportunities are really the bread and butter for the agency. That's where the majority of our hunting takes place. And that's what a lot of our hunter recruitment effort, new hunters coming in are doing those general seasons. So one of our biggest priorities is trying to create simpler, easier to understand general season regulations.
I'm going to take a question for myself. Nick, our first four speakers expressed some dissatisfaction with the process in one way or another. And OHA did that on the phone with me and with other commissioners. And at the same time, they praised the wolf plan and said that it's a really good wolf plan, and they worked with ODFW on that. And so I'm trying to understand those comments in respect to this process. And maybe you can help me and some of the other commissioners understand why this dedicated partner who has praise for you on the wolf plan feels that their voice wasn't really heard.
So Chair Finley, I too had the same meeting and conversation with OHA. OHA, you know, obviously, as you mentioned, a valuable partner to the department, and we have worked with them extensively through the last year in getting them our proposed changes in late May, about 4 months ago, and talking with them and meeting with them. And we had that meeting several weeks ago, and they expressed concerns about several of our proposals and had suggestions or had things they wanted to see changed. And we really had to weigh that with, you know, what is the science that supports some of like the black-tailed deer bag limit issue? What is the science versus what the public comments? And then also we had to weigh, you know, OHA valuable partner, but we have other sport groups, we have the public as well, and we have our survey data, and kind of weighing that. So we didn't take that decision lightly, but of their several concerns that they raised with us, we took that information and chose not to amend our proposals based on it. But like you said, very valuable partner that we plan on continuing to work with over the next year as we continue with this project.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to give it a try. I would make a motion.
Well, wait a minute, we're not ready.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were done.
Call the question.
I have to kick it.
Sorry.
Yeah, Commissioner Z.
I have, I read through this whole plan and got through a lot of the public comments. And I had a time limitation because I was out of town, but I was trying to read it while I was visiting my 90-something-year-old parents. But I felt there was great information on the bears and the cougar, very detailed about populations and MOs and things like that. And I didn't get that same sort of line out in tables and graphs in the other big game, the deer and the elk. And, you know, there was written stuff about it, but there wasn't a lot of details. And if I'd had more time, I would have done more digging online through wildlife division's information or calling you folks, but I didn't have a lot more time, unfortunately. So, but in the future, I'd really like to see that type of detail. Maybe it's just because I'm a biologist and I'm new to dealing with seasons. Well, I've been involved with them in various ways for a number of years. I like to have that to understand where the department's coming from when they're making their recommendations, especially with the mule deer situation. That is pretty concerning to, I'd hate to stop hunting in those, but to make sure that there's some other options, possibly some were proposed by people here, members of the public, but to take that really seriously, because 2 years could make a big difference if you're at almost at MO or just barely above it. And you get a bad winter, you get a drought, you get fires, and all the rest of that. So I'd like to see that in the future. That would certainly help me be more comfortable with making a decision of a major plan like this than just having a bunch of things written down and not a lot of detail. Thank you.
Commissioner Zarnowitz, we can certainly add more detail. For us, it's always a challenge to how much, it's a 70-page document already. It's always a challenge is how much is too much, but we can certainly add to some of the deer and elk population information. And we do have that available. If we can send you some of that also, make sure that you have it.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Send it to all of us, would you, Tom? Commissioner Snowbrink.
3 final things. One is on the late season buck hunts for Fossil, Hefner, and John Day. Did you have better mule deer populations, the mature buck populations in those areas to propose those hunts?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Spellbrink, yeah, while that testimony was going on, I went and looked at some of the data, and our statewide average buck ratio after the seasons have occurred is 19 bucks per 100 does, and that actually is a conservative estimate because during our surveys we rarely count all of the animals out there in the population. So the buck numbers available for those very limited number of tags they're there on the landscape.
Okay, 2 other things. One thing is, did you guys see this and what? I just wonder if you had an opinion on the proposed addendum to the and clarification for the computerized scopes or whatever that the one person testified to. Did you have a chance to look at that at all or have an opinion on that?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Spellbrink, yes, I did. That slide is from a year ago, and I did look back at it. It's not in color there, but anticipating that folks would be here, I did pull that back up, and all of the text in white on the screen was pre-existing last year, and initially we were going to add, and scopes with internal rangefinders were already illegal because they emit a beam to the target. But there's always confusion about that, so we added the wording in green initially. But then, as we continue to discuss all of the newer technologies now with their range-finding binoculars and all types of things, we approached the commission with the idea of moving the bar a little further to limit the technology that people were using. So that is kind of, that's pretty much how that came about.
And yeah, like I said, there's been so much information here that some of it gets convoluted. So I'm not quite sure even what the person that testified there from 6 Hour was, what was he trying to accomplish? Was he trying to change the regulation a little bit?
He didn't specify. I believe there may be, you folks, well, you do have some information from him that may give it in more detail. In his testimony, he didn't really specify, but I think when he was talking about allowing additional technology to be more interesting to the younger generation, to appeal to them, I think that's what I kind of took home, was that they would like to see some of the products that they have be made legal, that are, with this regulation, they're restricted.
And finally, okay, on some of the testimony, there was several mentions about the preference point system, and I think they were proposals to be able to choose how many preference points you could use to apply for hunt. I can see what, with point creep and everything, there's some people that end up with 14, 15 points, and all of a sudden maybe a hunt got changed or something changed, and now all of a sudden, to just go back and go to a hunt that takes 3 preference points, they're gonna lose all 14 preference points. Is that the way it is now, isn't it?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Spellbrink, yes, that is correct. That although another alternative, some folks will take 2 or 3 other people with them, and that didn't have points, so you can take the family, even if the family's been on another hunt recently. Colorado tried some type of a system. I don't know every detail about it, but they did try a system for 1 year where they allowed hunters to essentially declare or to only use the amount of preference points that was necessary. And I did talk to a biologist there, and they had a lot of problems implementing that, and it still wound up taking more preference points from hunters than they anticipated it would, so they had dissatisfaction with that. The other thing I can tell you from personal experience is that our controlled hunt section receives an untold number of calls from hunters every year who do not agree with the number of preference points they see when they go online and check it. They may have had a deer tag a few years ago that they forgot about, or whatever it might be. So it's important for us to be able to keep the history of where those came and went. I won't say that it couldn't be done, but it would greatly complicate the system.
Well, I'm fine with that explanation. I just figured since it was in the testimony, I'd address it.
Okay, what I'd like to do is have some internal discussions with, where Commissioner Labhart is, and I want to know if you're ready to call the question, how you feel about this, whether you have any strong feelings about offering an amendment, or just take the pledge of the department that they'll perform due diligence and prevent us with the amendments to what they're trying to enact this time, next year.
If we pass this, I would, and we've already been assured by the department that we're gonna look at, see how it works. Sometimes, what, did they say that about health insurance? We had to pass it so we knew how it was gonna work.
Oh, you had to bring that up, didn't you?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would just add on that subject that both as a practical matter and as a technical matter, we do these regulations every year. So unlike a plan, when we're updating, for instance, the wolf plan, we don't do that every year. We do that every 5 years. Or when we're updating our cougar plan, we don't do that every year. We do that every 10 years. But when it comes to these regulations, both practically and technically, we do this every year. So there is the opportunity to be nimble and make adjustments and adapt.
And of course, I think an important partner is enforcement, because I'm sure enforcement has some concerns over some of these regulations. So I'm sure that's part of the program going forward, is to see how this works out. for
Always
enforcement.
is, so.
Just follow up on Wood Richter's
Sure.
points. We'll see this again next September, and every year after is what I understand. I've also heard 4 times today that this is once in a lifetime. Could you just make sense of those two?
Sure. Chair Finley and Commissioner Wall. We do big game regulations every year. The commission adopts them. That's our normal process. We do that now in September. I think the once in a lifetime reference was the actually taking a year and a half or 2 years, whatever it was that Nick was on assignment, and completely reviewing not just the individual regulations, but the entire complexity or body of our big game hunts, combined with the public survey, can't remember the terms that Mr. Duder used, the probability sample, whatever, survey. I mean, it is like at least once in a professional career generation. We did not take this assignment on lightly. It's not something we took on because we just like to make changes for the sake of making changes. We took it on because we've heard over the years from a whole lot of people about things in the regs that they wanted changed, that we've heard many times about how our regulations are a barrier to participation. It's not a barrier to me. I've been reading the regulation book in Oregon since I was 12 years old for the last 43 years. I've been reading regulation books. So, hey, it progressed, it got
Did you
more
ever finish it?
complicated. Every year I finish it, but it progresses, it gets more complicated, but you're used to it, and so you're adding a little complexity at a time. That's not the case for new hunters, people that we're trying to recruit. So we don't want to do this every year in terms of this comprehensive review, but we do regulations every year, and we do adapt. We make changes every year as things come up.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. So we have that, which is a routine commitment, and I'll get a same commitment from Tom and the team that they're going to continue to reach out as they do so well. And then I'd ask you if you're all ready to call the question. Okay?
Well, is the question to accept all of the changes in their entirety, or as been suggested, are there 2 or 3 issues or concerns that we want to call out that are exceptional that we may want to discuss and either amend or revisit, leave and revisit another time, or it seems like there's a couple of 2 or 3 ways to go about this.
Well, the only commissioner who expressed that openly is Commissioner Wall. So if you would like to put a motion on floor, we'll process that.
Well, I will try that then. I do think, I agree with what you said, Director Melcher, that this is once in a lifetime and that also that we will do this every year. I think what that means is, and I'll make it into a motion in a minute, I think what that means is that next year will also be extraordinary because that will be the first year that we're looking at the results of this monumental change that we have made and the complete review we have made. So next year becomes somewhat unusual as well, almost by definition. And I would, for my own taste, and this would be the motion, is that I would move that staff do have, if you can stand. So let me back up. I would move that the staff do have a work group to look at the items that I mentioned earlier, and they're the ones that were the big ones that people were concerned about, which were black-tailed deer, mule deer, and see if there are any fixes that you would make now, which would have to come back in October or November or soon. So that, I'll stop there.
Okay, do I hear a second?
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion. Are you talking after the fact, if we pass this, that commitment is made? So you're not talking about a delay in adopting these? Okay. So,
Just clarification, I'm not sure I understood. Are we proposing to change, I mean, if we put the work group together and they meet for a couple of weeks to change a rule?
I don't think that they would meet for a couple of weeks. I think this would take some time, and then they would bring back in 2 months, 4 months, any changes that they come up with that they think that should have been amended. I think there is some additional discussion. We've heard so much from other groups about needing additional discussion that it seems worth a work group meeting or two to do. So I think we should go ahead and vote yes or no on what's before us or the motion that you're about to make. But I would move that we not throw out this notion of a work group.
So just clarification, Commissioner. So if that affects a regulation that goes into effect in 2020 and they don't complete their work until January, is that, I'm just trying to understand. I'm not saying I disagree, I'm just trying to understand.
I don't know the answer to that right now because I haven't thought that part all the way through.
Okay.
But I think that we have an issue on the table that's important, and that is to have this additional discussion. If there were a rule change that work group came up with that said that is not timely, we have to move forward anyway. So we would move forward with the rules that we adopt now. And then their recommendation would have to come in September of next year as an amendment.
Mr. Chair, the September of next year is very doable. The risk with something prior to that is these regulations literally go to the printer in, I want to say, in the next 30 to 60 days.
Okay.
And so we wouldn't want to, we
Fast
try to
track it or
avoid
not do
changing
it.
regulations after the
I do know that.
Okay.
Okay.
So as far as September next year, not a problem, but
any further discussion on the motion? We have a motion on the floor.
Could somebody repeat the motion for me, make sure I understand it?
For that discussion. Based on what I just heard, I move that we ask staff to have a work group meeting or two, that anything you can bring in 60 days so that we don't mess up the printing of these new regs, we bring forward, and that next September be a report back on this comprehensive change so that it's not just a regular rulemaking, but that we also have a report back on the impacts of all of these changes.
Okay. Commissioner Z, you seconded. Are you willing to second this?
Yes, second.
Could I just ask staff does staff understand that, Director?
thanks, Chair Finley and Commissioner Lampard. I do want to make sure that
But it doesn't interfere with the process of adopting these regulations.
It does
And
not.
send them to the printer. That's the point.
Okay, that's fine. I just, the reason I wanted to clarify is that,
It's to kickstart the review of 2000 next fall's regulations, correct?
21, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure that, the reason I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page is that, so the regs go to the printer and they can tell me the exact date
Yeah.
in November. So the regs go to the printer in November. We don't have a commission meeting in November, so I just want to make sure that we all understand there's no opportunity for the commission to review these regulations until we get to the 2021 adoption date.
Unless there was some hidden thing that the staff brought to you and you brought to us to say that we
There's all-
missed this.
Mr. Chair, there's always opportunity. The commission's given us the latitude, for instance, to reduce tag numbers due to emergency because of a winter kill. And so I just do that.
Right,
But
yeah.
notwithstanding those emergencies,
Well, we're all in the same
okay.
program here, I think. All right. So, well, let's see. I'll make a motion. Oh, Commissioner Lappart, do you want to make the motion?
Do we have to vote on her motion first?
The motion.
Oh, I'm sorry, we do have to vote on the motion. All right, we have a motion on the floor. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
I abstained.
Okay. One abstention. So, it passes. Thank you, Mary. Now, are we ready to, Jim? Yeah.
There seemed to be, whoever wants to answer this, fine. There seemed to be a little bit of concern about that, the 3 new late season mule deer hunts in the Hefner Fossil and John Day River Canyon. Nick, enlighten me. You know,
Chair Finley, Commissioner Biddle, we have heard concerns specifically from Oregon Hunters Association about the mule deer hunts. We've also gotten a fair amount of positive feedback from public on those hunts. Again, there's 3 hunts, 10 tags for the fossil and the Hefner hunt, 20 tags for the John Day River Canyon. Those hunts were proposed by our district wildlife biologists who we that are responsible for those areas, who we rely on really looking at their data and their trends to determine if there is adequate number of bucks. While that's a very low tag number, and they believe there is that. And then also, they think they're going to be able to provide a really highly sought after, high quality opportunity. And then finally, the other discussion point they had is that putting those tags in a new hunt versus putting more tags in the existing hunt, they think it just provides, it kind of helps with hunter crowding and just provides a unique opportunity where you don't have to hunt with a bunch of other hunters.
You feel comfortable with it?
Yes.
Okay.
Commissioner Lappart, would you like to make a motion?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you. I move to amend OAR Chapter 635, Divisions 8, 43, 45, 60, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, and 75 as proposed by staff.
Second. Okay, so it's been moved by Commissioner Lappart, seconded by Commissioner Finley. Any further discussion? Yes.
Shouldn't we say
Commissioner
as amended by this amendment? Is that right?
The first motion was separate, and so I think that they can stand
Okay,
as 2.
thank you.
Z. Okay, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, it passes unanimously. Thank you, staff. Okay. Okay, next agenda item is
I think you took a
Exhibit E.
quick break, you'll be right back.
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break.
I like
Still looking for Greg.
Okay, man. Read it to us.
Yeah, this is what they sent me. Yeah. Finally figured out, I had to just.
All right.
Ready.
It's ready to go.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chair Finley, members of the Commission, Director Melcher. For the record, Derek Broman, I'm the Carnivore Fur Bearer Coordinator. Today I'm going to be talking about some proposed changes to our fur bearer regulations, and this is specific to marten in coastal areas of Oregon. So a bit of the history why we're here today. We received an Administrative Procedures Act petition in early 2018. This is an APA petition. These petitions are essentially requests from the public for a regulation change that can be submitted by any member of the public or group of individuals. In that petition, it requested 3 changes to current rule. One would be to prohibit marten harvest west of Interstate 5. The other would be to eliminate essentially fur bearer and unprotected mammal trapping in the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area. And it would prohibit the use of traps or snares suspended in trees in the Siskiyou and Siuslaw National Forest. This petition was accepted by the Commission in August 2018, and that enacted a rulemaking process. So just like many of the other regulations that we've heard here today, especially the big game regulations, this petition introduced a concept for discussion. And by accepting that petition, we enacted that process. Bit of confusion, I believe, by the petitioners on what the accepting of that petition meant, and we were met with a lawsuit in December that requested a ban of marten trapping with the understanding that by accepting the petition, the commission ordered a trap ban, and the trap ban was to be implemented immediately. The judge denied that request, but before a follow-up hearing, settlement was reached with the plaintiffs. And that settlement consisted of scheduling a commission meeting to conclude this rulemaking process by the beginning of the next marten harvest season. So we're doing that here today. And we would summarize the harvest information from the most recent winter, the 2018-19 harvest season. And also distinguishing marten that were harvested in these coastal areas to distinguish them between those and those from the Cascades. Based on our data, no marten were harvested in any of those coastal areas. So by presenting that information and having this meeting here today, we are completing the settlement agreements. So there are no other requirements or complications associated with that. So a little bit more of a background on the marten. Marten in coastal Oregon and California were petitioned for listing under the federal ESA in 2010. In 2015, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined the distinct population segment was not warranted. A lawsuit challenged that determination, and the judge ruled that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to reconsider their finding. And we are awaiting a listing determination that will likely come in the coming months of 2019. So what happens here today, if the animal were to be federally listed, we would have to evaluate our regulations, whatever they may look like at that point, to see if any changes would need to be made to be in compliance with federal ESA restrictions. As far as Oregon classification, marten statewide are classified as a fur bearer species. They're on the sensitive species list, and they're an Oregon conservation strategy species. Their designation under those two things primarily has to do with knowledge gaps and understandings of habitat needs and some distribution and potential conservation threats. Regarding the distribution and range of marten, it's a little bit complicated past, but previously it was assumed that there was one species of marten throughout all of North America, the American marten. But some genetic work in 2012 determined that they thought there were two species of martin, the American martin, which resides east of the Rockies, and the Pacific martin that resides west of the Rockies. So Oregon has just the Pacific martin. When it comes to subspecies, it was historically assumed that we have, or research suggested that we had two subspecies of martin. Martin in the northeast Oregon were one subspecies, and then those on the coast and the Cascades were another subspecies. It was just about a decade ago that additional genetic work came back and suggested that the martin in coastal Oregon were much more similar to martin in the northwest coast of California, which is the Humboldt subspecies. So most recent publications are now considering all martin in coastal Oregon and California to be this Humboldt subspecies. However, the history of this Humboldt subspecies, was this the animal that was always in the Oregon coast, or did it reestablish? There's also been some difficulty in trying to get good genetic samples, even currently, and because of the confusion and still some of the fluidity of this situation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service simply refers to these martin on the coast of Oregon and California as coastal martin, and we'll certainly take their lead. So as far as these animals in coastal Oregon, the image there on the far left shows historical detections of martin from 1980 to 2013. Those little dark dots are detection locations. A publication from a few years ago showed locations from 2014 and 2015. Those dark locations are more contemporary locations. The lighter, the gray dots are survey areas. And far right image consists of information up through 2017. The dark black spots are survey locations. The yellowish orange boxes and stars represent Oregon or martin detections. So you can see that there's actually been a documented population persistence throughout the Cascades dating back a number of decades now. And contemporary surveys are actually detecting martin in new locations. You can see in the far right image, there's quite a few more squares and stars where there weren't in previous survey efforts. And again, this map is only up through 2017. There's also new information in 2018 and 19 to continue to fill in some of those gaps. So evaluating that petition, the first request was to eliminate martin harvest west of Interstate 5. The petition, much of the text referred to banning trapping of martin west of I-5, but the rule recommendations were to eliminate the harvest season. So by doing so, you would eliminate hunting, trapping, and roadkill salvage west of Interstate 5. Now that area west of 5 does encompass the majority of the extant coastal martin population. And I'm going to present a number of, I'm going to be presenting a lot of numbers on harvest and mortality rates over the last 31 years. And I'm saying the last 31 years because our fur bearer data, the contemporary data that we have, which is some of the best in the country, dates back 31 years. So not only do we have numbers on animals harvested and which county they came from, we also have information on effort. We also have information on bycatch. So when we have harvest numbers, not only do we have harvest numbers, we know people that were trying to harvest a particular animal, or we're trying to harvest something else and got something else as bycatch. So this is a pretty robust data set dating back 3 decades. So over the last 3 decades, in that area west of I-5, the average annual martin harvest is less than 1 per year. There have not been any martin harvested west of Interstate 5 since 2014. And despite that, there's been detections of martin in these counties over that time. There haven't been any martin harvested in Benton, Lincoln, Lane, and Curry counties. When we include all other known sources of mortality, which includes like roadkills and found dead, we average just slightly more than 1 martin per year for that entire region west of Interstate 5. The second request is to essentially eliminate all mammal trapping in the Dunes National Recreation Area. And from here on out, when I say the dunes, I'm meaning that recreation area. It covers portions of Lane, Douglas, and Coos County and essentially stretches from Florence down to Coos Bay. Trapped martin in those 3 counties includes 10 in Coos County. Again, this is over the last 31 years. 10 in Coos County, but none since 2014. Historically, 3 in Douglas County, none since 2008, and we haven't had any marten harvested in Lane County. So for those counties that encompass the dunes, our average trap mortalities or harvest mortalities are just, again, under 1 per year. When we include all other known mortality sources, including a number that have been taken from research efforts, again, for the dunes, we're looking at 1 marten per year throughout the whole dunes area. Continuing on this topic of the trapping in the dunes, there's been a lot of interest in the dunes regarding marten because there's been a number of recent research projects conducted in that area. One such effort consisted of a population viability analysis, which was a modeling exercise that essentially looks at situations where you have a starting population and based on varying levels of mortality, what might be the population response? And is it viable? There are a number of issues with that modeling exercise, some of the primary ones being that there's assumptions that these populations were isolated, yet marten have been detected immediately adjacent to those study areas. And they're assuming higher numbers of mortalities than we've ever documented. Assumptions of 1, 2, or 3 every year in each study area for a range of, for decades or more, just has not been documented in Oregon. So despite some of those issues, this modeling effort may shed some light on why we continue to see some population persistence. Their model observed that if you had lower levels of human-caused mortality, you saw population viability. It continued. And based on our empirical data, that kind of makes sense and may explain why we still have populations based on the level of mortality we've observed. Also in the dunes, there are efforts by federal agencies to trap fur bearers and unprotected mammals to benefit snowy plovers. That consists of trapping things like coyotes, raccoons, foxes, and skunks to benefit those nests. Also, bobcats have been proposed as a possible conservation threat to coastal marten. So we are concerned about the potential unintended consequences of eliminating licensed trapping in the dunes that might have a negative impact on plover efforts and coastal marten conservation efforts. The third proposal is to prohibit the use of traps or snares suspended in trees in the Siskiyou and Siuslaw National Forests. Certainly coastal marten are found in both the Siskiyou and Siuslaw National Forest, but they're also found in a number of state lands and BLM properties as well. The dunes do occur in a portion of the Siuslaw National Forest, but outside the dunes, no marten have been reported harvested in these forests. Regarding traps or snares suspended in trees, that description is quite difficult to interpret, and when it comes to enforcement, there's quite a bit of challenges and what that means, interpretation, and complexities associated with that description. But something along those lines are leaning pole sets, or lean pole sets. Those are techniques for trapping marten, where essentially a pole or a stick is suspended off the ground, either leaning against a tree or a rock or a root wad, whatever it may be. That is one option, but no other states prohibit lean pole sets. We don't have any language to use to try and restrict those activities. Nonetheless, lean pole sets aren't used for any other harvested fur bearers in the state of Oregon besides marten. So their use is already pretty limited, and so it just is quite a challenge to try to come up with language that can define what it is we're trying to prohibit while also not having a number of other unintended consequences. So overall, the first request, which is specific to harvest west of Interstate 5, does encompass the extant range of the coastal marten, but it also covers quite a bit more area as well. We do have some concerns about restricting activities and limiting ourselves on the amount of information made available to us based on harvest. The second request, which is specific to the dunes, does indeed represent the area that we heard the most comment on from the public and also in the lawsuit. The dunes were actually prioritized over any other area or any other topic. And certainly this is an interest to researchers and managers as well. But again, we do have concerns about eliminating all licensed mammal trapping in the dunes because of potential other consequences. And again, request number 3 about trapping in trees. We haven't been able to find any adequate language, and even speaking with OSP, that would be adequate to prohibit those activities and not create a bunch of confusion and frustration. But at the same time, the use of those traps are very rare. So just, it's hard to see a lot of the value in that request itself. So based on the examination of the petition, looking at public comment and working with affected user groups, we do have a couple staff proposals. One is that we propose marten harvest be prohibited in the dunes. So that means hunting, trapping, and roadkill salvage in the dunes would be prohibited. Certainly the dunes contains marten. There's likely harvest that's occurred in the dunes in the past, and it's an area of interest for wildlife and habitat managers. Some of the new efforts are to try to see if those populations are indeed connected to others, and what habitat improvement projects might we look to explore in the near future. Plus, having a regulation that's specific to an extant population is beneficial rather than those that are a little bit too large and excessive. But again, we want to make sure that we reduce negative unintended consequences, so that's why it's just limited to marten harvest in the dunes, not all fur bearer unprotected mammal harvest. Our second proposal is to have a mandatory submission of all carcasses of marten harvested west of Interstate 5. Right now, we have it in our regulations that we request marten carcasses be turned into the agency. Most of the harvest occurs in the Cascades and the Blue Mountains, and we get about a dozen carcasses annually, but this would be a mandatory requirement. That'll help increase our data collection opportunities, and we can also continue to get more biological information from those marten. And so these staff proposals, again, were primarily a big gesture of compromise by the affected user groups. Going into these discussions, there didn't seem to be any compromise available. They felt that there was not an identifiable problem, and the data supported that. But we got to this point through some very good, robust conversations. So I can help take any questions right now, or just wait till we turn after public comment.
Yeah, we'll see you. Okay, we do have public comment, commissioners. Amy Patrick? Stan Steele? Oh. Jim Short? Amy, we'll start with you.
Okay.
3 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chair Finley, members of the Commission, Director Melcher. Again, my name is Amy Patrick, and I represent the Oregon Hunters Association. The Oregon Hunters Association has voiced strong opposition to the petition to ban marten trapping west of the I-5 corridor since its presentation to the Commission last year. We continue to have concerns regarding the lack of peer-reviewed scientific evidence presented to support the petition's requests. Currently, as you heard, there are ongoing research projects focused on marten population in Western Oregon. And in light of these studies, we support the recommended rules changes proposed by ODFW staff. Setting aside the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area as a non-marten trapping area supports the current research projects, while also continuing the use of a very useful management tool for marten predators such as bobcats, as you heard. While trapping has been virtually non-existent in recent years, turning in the carcass of any marten trapped, including roadkill or mortalities from research projects, will assist in the ongoing data collection by ODFW and additional organizations. OHA supports science-based management of Oregon's wildlife, both game and non-game species. The rules changes proposed by staff are based on factual agency reports, and they offer support to ongoing research of the marten population. In the absence of this research, any broad sweeping rules changes set a dangerous precedent by eliminating a very impactful management tool without clear scientific justification. We support the staff recommendations, and we urge the Commission to approve it as presented. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Finley, Commissioners, Director Melcher, my name is Stan Steele. I agree with what she said. Amy said it very, very well. But this morning during the crab testimony on the commercial crabbing and the interception and interaction with whales, I thought, how ironically the same. We are talking about ensnarement, unintended consequences, and the impact that those are having on another large mammal. And I thought, we unanimously voted that we would approve that there could be some encounters there, even though we wish there wouldn't be. We approved methods that we know are having some impact. When I was writing up my notes to you, I had no idea that we were going to have that type of a discussion on commercial crab. And I even mentioned, what's next in here? Commercial crabbing? Is that the next thing that's under attack? There's rarely a thing we do in wildlife science that does not impact one species or another. Trapping, you know, I've been a trapper longer than I've been a hunter. I'm an ardent conservationist. 95 bluebird boxes up on my property at home. I took the day off from planting elk pasture so I could come down and talk about these issues. It's not just about the harvest, it's also about our culture and our heritage. And I remember a recent commission meeting where I was told that wasn't important from one of our commissioners. I really want to direct them back to the wildlife policy and our 7 co-equal goals. Social attitudes, social interactions with our wildlife is really why we're all here today, isn't it? We care about wildlife and we care about people. But as a trapper, when we're not having an impact on the species level population viability, it's then just more about ideology. We just don't want something harvested. We don't want that method used. We don't want a longbow. We don't want a crossbow or whatever it may be. So some of these attacks are absolutely just ideological attacks. Martin and Oregon are not threatened. How many years has it been since we caught the last one in this area? And in Benton County, I'm not sure we have a recorded catch. So my plea to you is to let's follow science. Let's not worry about banning certain harvest methods or cultures. Let's follow science. Science should always, along with social pressures, help us. But remember, small groups are as important as large groups. Thank you.
Dan? Mr. Soares?
Chair Finley, Director Melcher, members of the commission. For the record, my name is Jim Soares. I'm from Wallowa, Oregon. I'm Vice President of the Oregon Trappers Association. This marten population that we're talking about in the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area is known to be the densest marten population in North America, absolutely the densest. In addition, these marten have been found both north and south of the Oregon Dunes, leading us to believe this population is not as geographically isolated as some have stated. In the last 5 years, no marten have been taken by trappers in Coos, Douglas, Lane, and Lincoln counties. During that time, 3 marten were killed by researchers, 2 of those being illegal because they were not permitted. The real question here for researchers, I would think, is why is this population of marten so successful in an area that's not normally considered marten habitat? Now, since 1989, trappers on average have taken less than 1 marten every 2 years. 0.42 marten per year is what trappers have taken. In view of this and the fact that 0 marten have been trapped in the last 5 years, we feel that trappers are being unfairly targeted and they really have no significant effect on the marten population. Having said this, the Oregon Trappers Association will support the staff recommendations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Soares. Commissioners, any questions to the panel? Good job. Thank you for coming. You too, Stan. Okay, next panel. Nawa, Tierra Curry, and Kyle Williams. you, Ms. Curry.
Thank you. Chair Finley, Director Melcher, Commissioners. I love Humboldt Martins. They're so rare that they were thought to be extinct. In 2010, a paper was published saying that they still existed, and since that time I've been trying to get protection for them. I'm a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity. I wrote the petition requesting federal protection for the martins, both of the state petitions in Oregon and the California petition. Oregon has to do better by its Humboldt Martins. There's fewer than 200 of them left in the state and 2 isolated populations. My son and I go to the coast every summer to try to see them. We've never seen one, even though we crawl around on our bellies at twilight looking for them. California has protected them as endangered. Mr. Broman left out in his presentation that they are now proposed for protection under the Federal Endangered Species Act. They were proposed last October. That's set to be finalized October 9th of this year. And they're proposed as threatened with a 4D rule that covers take. So if the final federal listing is the same as the proposed listing, then Oregon will be authorizing the take of a federally endangered species and will also be responsible for incidental take of martins. If less than 1 martin is trapped per year, then why would it be such a big deal to ban them anyway, to ban their trapping? The average isn't what matters. What matters is the risk. 3 coastal martins were trapped in 2014, 3 in 2013, 2 in 2011, and that's on top of roadkill. The people who spoke before me said to follow the science. The peer-reviewed published paper published by Oregon State University says that if 2 or 3 of these martins die per year, the population will be extirpated within 30 years. Mr. Broman has a problem with that paper. The authors of that paper submitted comments today. I have those that I could read to you, but one of the things that they say is Humboldt Martins are now so rare and martins are so trap happy that a relatively small amount of trapping effort could eliminate the remnant populations. That's from Tal Leviat, professor of wildlife at Oregon State University, and it's in the record because he emailed it today. So I ask that you amend the staff recommendation to ban all martin trapping west of the I-5 corridor, which would include the historical range of the Humboldt Martin, and to ban tree traps in the Siskiyou and Siuslaw National Forest. Just because the language doesn't exist somewhere doesn't mean the language can't be written. And that recreational and commercial mammal trapping be banned in the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area. This would ensure compliance with the Federal Endangered Species Act, and it would allow for the recovery of Humboldt Martins in Oregon. The reason the population in the dunes is so dense is because they don't cross open areas. So it's a remnant population that just survives there because of all the small mammals and birds that live in that area, but they're trapped. There's 4 total populations of Humboldt Martins. All 4 populations have less than 100 individuals each. Oregon's martins are in the same boat as California's, and California has protected them as endangered. Thank you.
Thank you. Rich Nawa.
Chair Finley, Commission members, and Director Melcher. Thank you for staying here. This huge marathon, you all look pretty attentive and listening. I appreciate it. Anyway, my name is Richard Nawa. I'm the staff ecologist with the Klamath Siskiyou Wildlands. I am testifying in support of the previous speaker, Taryn, and her comment. KS Wild is one of the co-signers on that. I am concerned that the recommended action by ODFW is not consistent with recommendations made by Martin researchers. I have distributed to you, or I've had distributed to you, an abstract of the published paper titled Distribution of Pacific Martin in Coastal Oregon. And I underline the important statement. I'll read this into the record. The underlined statement: until population estimates and trends are known, conservation efforts may benefit from local management actions such as restricting or eliminating kill trapping in the coast ranges. There's nothing in here about having a trapping season so we can get more data on martin. If they wanted that to happen, they would probably said it, and they didn't. They said, no, let's stop the trapping before it becomes a problem. I'm also alarmed by the analysis by ODFW and proposed rules that would promote lethal trapping outside the dunes for the purpose of monitoring. The ODFW essentially tells the trapping community that successful martin trapping west of I-5 has not been reported for 5 years. The proposed rule would authorize trapping with the requirement of providing ODFW with carcasses for monitoring purposes. A single trapper could decide to help ODFW out with lethal monitoring by targeting the home ranges identified in the published paper, page 73, and ODFW has put up maps showing the trappers where they are, the home rangers are there. Previously, they didn't know where they are, now they do. I caution the commissioners to be careful about what you authorize. What happens to Humboldt Martin conservation when trappers begin turning in carcasses to ODFW as requested? Any hope for range expansion will be gone because of misguided decision-making.
Okay, thank you, sir. Let's see, Kyle?
Sure. Chair Finley, Director Melcher, members of the commission, once again, for the record, my name is Kyle Williams, and I am the Director of Forest Protection for the Oregon Forest and Industries Council. Thanks again for the opportunity to quickly provide input on the proposed Martin harvest rule changes. And again, Jonathan Sandow from the Oregon Farm Bureau was unable to make it today, but we do share the same comments for both of our organizations. In an effort to be brief, our submitted letter further outlines our concerns in more detail, but largely they agree with the cautionary principles outlined in the staff report. We believe the best place for sound science-based management of Oregon's wildlife, both game and non-game species, lies within the recommendations of the staff at ODFW. Our concern with the original petition requested actions lie within the ironclad rule of unintended consequences. The process of banning otherwise legal actions and applying broad stroke geographic prohibitions on recreational activities that have not been demonstrated to cause harm will inevitably lead to downstream negative impacts. I want to be very clear, OFIC, OFB, and its member companies and members acknowledge the important research value of the Humboldt Martin populations within the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area. Further, we are encouraged and impressed by the effort and compromise put forth by both the impacted communities and ODFW staff on this topic. To that end, our organizations are supportive of the proposed amendment to the regulations set forth by Department of Fish and Wildlife staff to close martin trapping in the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area and require martin carcass turn-in west of I-5. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. Commissioners? Okay.
I have one question.
Commissioner Wall.
I think your name is Tiara. Could you say again what you said about less than 200 in Oregon? What is that based on, or did I get your information right?
That's correct. The peer-reviewed published science papers say in the Federal Conservation Status Assessment say that there are two populations of Humboldt Martins in Oregon, one in the dunes, it's about 74 individuals, and one on the southern coast just north of the California border that's also less than 100 individuals. The Northern California and Southern Oregon populations used to be connected, but they were separated by the Chetco Bar Fire, and because martins won't cross open areas, the populations are isolated now.
Okay. Thank you, panel. Next up, Eileen Cooper, Phoebe Lenhart, and Mike Miller. You, Ms. Cooper.
Eileen, they're starting with you.
Eileen Cooper, Vice President of Friends of Illinois, that I have prepared these comments myself. Recommendations are too little, too late. List the Humboldt Martin. Give it the protection under the Oregon ESA. Develop habitat protection plan. Science is in now. Humboldt or coastal martin is a distinct subspecies. There are less than 400 total. And it is such a limited population that the science predicts extirpation in Oregon with loss of 3 per year over 30 years. The presentation of diluting the impacts to Humboldt Martin over a 30-year period is unjust, is deceitful. I sat through a presentation where California Humboldt Martin was analyzed in California Fish and Wildlife meeting, and all of the impacts to the Humboldt Martin are accelerating. This time that we live in is not the same as 30 years ago. There are cars on the road in much greater numbers. The growth rate of the coastal area is tremendous in this 30-year period. I remember coming here 25 years ago. It was a small town, all up and down the coast. The growth, the threat from poisoning is increasing and accelerating. The impacts from wildfires are huge with climate change. Every impact to the Humboldt Martin spells out extinction. What you are proposing is too little, too late. We need a conservation plan. We need our forests protected and restored. A half a martin over 30 years doesn't express what is happening to the martin today. 10 were trapped in Coos County in 2014 alone. 3 lost a year will lead to extirpation in Oregon. You cannot let things stand this way. You need to do more sooner. You need conservation, you need protection, and it needs to be adequate.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lenhart.
Hi, Chair and members. Thank you so much for your patience this evening and being with us on this last topic on your agenda. I'm Phoebe Lenhart, and I'm here to speak as a person, a very concerned person regarding climate change. And we've all heard that word, and we know the consequences are happening amongst us right now. The United Nations and many scientists have identified that we are currently in the 6th mass extinction, and this is the first mass extinction done by the effects of human behavior. Approximately 60% of the mammals are threatened with extinction right now, and being the fact that the martins are mammals, they need more protection, not less. I hope that you will realize that with climate change, that with the unpredictable future, really we need to be more conservative and be proactive with the protection. Also, I just wanted to bring to you from a personal science point of view that martins are mammals like us, and they do experience pain. And the pain inflicted by trapping is inhumane. It's an archaic method of killing that is beyond our conscious today. I think trapping should be prohibited, period. It's just not politically, it's not environmentally correct. It's not even accepted in the fashion industry. Furs are absolutely prohibited. They're using many synthetic fabrics that are absolutely better than natural furs. The martin is basically, as presented by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, we heard no population numbers. I didn't hear from Oregon DFW how many numbers there are in any of the places along Oregon. So there is a huge question as far as the research the department has done, since they cannot present population studies. And I would just like to say that to follow California's president, what population that those of us who are testifying in defense of the martin know, it's extremely small. and it's very vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I'm Mike Miller, live here in Gold Beach. I'm 30 years retired. Worked here 30 years as wildlife biologist for Forest Service. So I just want to bring up some of the Siskiyou habitat components. In 2011, the Siskiyou National Forest Management Indicator Species Analysis for pine marten found that the amount of habitat on the Siskiyou Forest is expected to provide the continued viability of pine marten on the Siskiyou National Forest. The Siskiyou National Forest, as modified by the Northwest Forest Plan, identifies 97% of the forest with no programmed timber harvest. The Siskiyou National Forest Plan identified 230,000 acres of wilderness, 284,000 acres of roadless areas greater than 5,000 acres. So wilderness and roadless areas total 516,000 acres, or 47% of the land base. The Siskiyou is extremely steep. A lot of it is poorly roaded, and it grows brush really fast. So as you know, you get the fire, but you get brush replacement in 5 years. So you really don't have a barrier for marten travel.
Okay, thank you, sir. Commissioners, any questions? Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes public testimony. I don't think so. What's your name? Okay, I missed you. I apologize. Come on up. Of course you do. I'm gonna give you some of Stan Steele's sign. And you, ma'am?
No, don't treat me like you do Stan Steele.
Okay.
Yeah, you're both on there.
Yeah.
Anybody first?
Legit.
Let her go. Go ahead.
Thank you. Chair, Commissioners, and Director, thank you for your time. I'm here today on behalf of the Humboldt Martin, a species for which only 200 individuals, or probably fewer, remain in the state of Oregon, separated into 2 isolated subpopulations. The overall population is so small that it is at risk of extinction, and the scientists have assured us that an additional 2 to 3 human-caused mortalities per year could be the cause of this extinction. Furthermore, the Federal Species Status Assessment identified trapping in Oregon as a primary threat to marten viability in Oregon. Conservationists have proposed a rule that would work to prevent one potential source of human-caused mortality, but staff have proposed a significantly weaker rule that only acts to preserve the one small northern subpopulation in the dunes, leaving the other subpopulation unprotected. I know many of you have a biology background, so you are well aware that small, isolated populations of wildlife, particularly carnivores, are unlikely to survive in the long term. Besides preserving the genetic diversity of both groups of Humboldt Martins, we also want to make sure both groups survive toward the eventual possibility of reconnecting, interbreeding, and recovery, which should be our goal. Due to an accident of geography, we share responsibility for the survival of this species with the state of California, which has summoned the will to put in place strong protections for its tiny portion of the Humboldt Martin population. It's not a good look for Oregon if we fail to live up to our end of this responsibility, and our lack of action is what allows this species to go extinct. We are enduring the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth, and like its twin crisis, climate change, we know that biodiversity loss can be slowed, mitigated, or even stopped by decisions made right now by people like you in rooms like the one we're sitting in today. When I hear that 1 million species are likely to go extinct in the next 100 years, my initial reaction is, my God, this is on us, and we have got to use every potential tool in our toolbox if we can stop this from happening to even one species. That's our responsibility. As members of a body that's charged with the responsibility to preserve all wildlife species for future Oregonians, I'd guess you feel the same.
The good news is we have in front of us a tool that can serve to stop one source of human-caused mortality to Humboldt Martins, but it must be applied to both of Oregon's subpopulations of martins. Staff has suggested that it is unable to craft a rule that will protect the southern population because it is too confusing or challenging to figure out exactly what kind of snares or traps to regulate. But I don't think any of you on this commission got to where you are today by being the kind of person who, when the going gets tough, throws your hands up in the air and says, I can't do it, it's too hard. Please direct staff to return to the drawing board and craft a rule that lives up to our shared responsibility to prevent extinction and fully protects both subpopulations of Humboldt Martins. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nickel.
Yes, sir. Chairman Finley, Commissioners, and Director Melcher, my name is Doug Nickel, and I am President of the Oregon Trappers Association. Oregon Trappers, for many years, supported and have been directly involved with the rules, seasons, and harvest limits under which we are allowed to help control the fur bearers here in Oregon. We have worked closely with the department on bobcat harvest numbers, trap size, and where those traps can and can't be used, red fox season limits in eastern Oregon, where traps can and not be used in relationship to trailheads, and a number of the other trapping-related regulations. This I state to show that Oregon trappers care about Oregon fur bearers and work closely with the department to help manage all Oregon fur bearers. There is a desire among some to have trapping in Oregon follow the example of California and Washington, where trapping has been stopped using techniques similar to proposals like this one, and expanded until all trapping was stopped. The coastal martin issue is not about the health or protection of a species of fur bearer that trapping has shown by harvest reports to be possibly limiting or affecting its expansion in the coast range. Oregon coastal martin are not and have never been threatened by trapping. They are being used as a talking point to begin the process to stop all trapping in Oregon, like what anti-groups use to outlaw trapping in California and Washington. Decisions concerning Oregon fur bearers need to be based upon strong scientific data, which is still ongoing for the coastal martin. Wildlife are too valuable to Oregon sportsmen to implement major changes based upon feelings and personal agendas. If martin are needing protected, why are we trappers the only group being asked to give up our freedom to exercise our chosen outdoor activity when other user groups are not involved in this proposal? Protecting a species has taken place in Oregon. Beaver have been protected from trapping in the Ochiko National Forest and different watersheds in Oregon for many, many years. Beaver are no more numerous now than when those closures began in those waterways. Many factors outside trapping are involved in the proper management of wildlife. Oregon trappers will support the department's proposed coastal martin trapping changes for the dunes recreational area and the mandatory check-in of martin carcasses. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions? Okay. Thank you, panel. I apologize for missing you. Okay. That's the end of the public testimony. Did I miss anyone else in the audience? Okay. Derek, come on back up. Commissioner Lampard.
So, yeah, just a clarification question, Derek. So I heard 200, I heard 400, and I'm sure you gave a number. What is the best estimate of Humboldt martin in Oregon?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Labhart, there is no population estimate for the range-wide coastal martin range population in Oregon. The only population estimate that's come out that's actually from empirical data was a study in the dunes, and through some camera monitoring and some collared animals, they came up with some density estimates, and they extrapolated that throughout what they deemed suitable habitat in their study areas. And that's where they got a range of 30 to 20 to 40 individuals per each of their 2 little study areas. So we don't know what the population estimate is. As we continue to get more detections in new areas, that number, if we were to take a stab at it, would be changing on a very regular basis.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Z.
I have a question. I've read in the letter from the trappers, and you mentioned it here, that there were 3 marten killed through research, and I'm wondering what, there's been no explanation about that.
Chair-friendly Commissioner Zarnowitz, yes, there were unfortunately 3 marten that were killed in the dunes in Lane County. One was killed in the late, early winter, late in the calendar year, and then 2 were killed in the following year. The necropsies determined it was capture myopathy, so because they were capturing them, there's too much stress from those animals and they died. Unfortunately, 2 of them were taken without a permit. That's been a little bit of a sore subject over the years, but fortunately, there hasn't been any capture efforts of research projects, and so that threat hasn't been around since then.
Was that to put on radio collars?
Yes, correct.
Okay. And was that, what year was that, or years?
That was in the winter of 2015, 2016. So I think that there was 1 killed in November 2015, and then 2 killed in like January, February 2016.
Commissioner Woolley and then Commissioner Wall.
Okay, I have a few questions and comments. Let's see, where do I start? So there's been some argument, let's start with this one. There's been some argument that trapping provides some useful population data. But if there's been so little trapping, then I don't understand if there is, or what the value is, or what information that a little bit of trapping provides us. And do you concur that it's insignificant, or do you feel that it's useful to give estimates? If there haven't been any, and no trapping in 3 years, and previously is very sporadic, is that a viable argument or not?
Chair-friendly Commissioner Woolley, so you're specifying trapping, but I'll first say that harvest in general has value because picking up roadkill marten is only lawful if you have a fur taker's license and the season is open, or you have a scientific taking permit. So the opportunity for people to lawfully pick up roadkill is a great way for us to get some of these mortality numbers, and also not so much absence, but definitely presence that has some value there. So we would like for people to have an eye on the squishy dead things on the side of the road that they can lawfully acquire. For trapping in particular, so that the harvest is not additive to the population where it is detrimental. Having that information of 1, where this occurred is an indication of where we have this animal. 2, with some of the trapping, because it is mandatory reporting, we know where people have tried to trap marten and were unsuccessful. And also when they are successful, we have that catch per unit effort. So we know, was it easy to get these marten? Was it hard to get these marten? And certainly that has some indications of what type of population are we looking at in this area. But if the harvest is too high and that's detrimental to that population, that doesn't have as much value. But considering this animal is a secretive animal, most of the public doesn't know what it is. Nobody knows what it looks like. Most couldn't tell the difference between a marten and a mink. These fur takers are the people that are paying attention to those minute details. And so having those eyes and ears out there can benefit us when we're still trying to fill in the gaps. We're trying to find out where these animals persisted. The arguments were that this dunes population is brand new and it was discovered a few years ago by researchers. That's not true. Trappers knew they've been there for many, many, many decades. But it's not as desirable as a fur bear as it is in the Cascades because of the quality of the fur. But so I went a little bit broad on your response.
That's okay. I mean, I feel that in theory, it could be useful, but in practice, in terms of activity that actually occurs, it doesn't. I don't feel that it tells us very much. I can't allow Chair Finley to enjoy all the pleasure of picking on Stan Steele by himself, and so I have to join in. And I am very much supportive of tradition, historical lifestyle, heritage, when it makes sense, but not only for its own sake. I think when it impacts other species, that there's some balance that needs to be made. And Stan, you talked about science, and Fundamental Ecology 101 that I took 40 years ago told me that when you have small, disjunct, geographically isolated populations of small numbers, they should have more protection and not less. Even if the population is not confirmed to be, universally confirmed to be in decline, the very fact that they are small populations, they are separated. There is no reason to not provide more protection. Derek, moving on from that, the petitioners do a lot of quoting from research from Variety and Linnell. Do you feel that the petitioners accurately interpret the conclusions of those researchers, or do you question it? Because they do, they quote them a lot, and they're kind of leaning on that research to substantiate their positions. So what's your opinion about that?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Woolley. There is some consistently inconsistent use of this information. So in this PVA, where they modeled the population response, first off, that is focusing on the dunes. Again, all the emphasis has been on the dunes. Everything else just kind of falls to the wayside. This expression of 1, 2, 3 mortalities leads to extinction. That's been a general statement said over and over again for some time. But in the paper, what they're looking at are 2 different study areas, and they are seeing what would happen based on varying starting population sizes if you had an average of 1, 2, or 3 mortalities every single year. So that's 2 to 3 mortalities per study area every year for 30 years. We've never seen any information like that ever. Over 30 years in Oregon, we've averaged less than 1 across the entire range. So first off, having that in one of those focal study areas may be the case in that exercise. That's primarily based on information they brought in from the literature and even on other different species. So while that scenario could take place within those study areas, that is not representative of the full range. None of that has anything to do with animals that occur further southwest and not in the dunes. So that 1, 2, 3, and that's an average, so it's every single year. We've never seen that before. Not to mention, it's an average. It's not actually 1, 2, or 3, it's an average. So there's years where they can have 4, 5, 6, 7. And so if you have a starting population of 20 animals and you allow for that many to be taken, it's no big surprise that you can see a population go extinct, especially when you're assuming they're geographically isolated. And so when you're going through this modeling exercise, in some cases it's more art than science, especially if you haven't done the research to parameterize the model. You use the best information that you can find out in the literature. And unfortunately, we've seen very regularly that we can barely even extrapolate things from Northern California into Oregon. So having a lot of those assumptions, and you can get an idea if you've done any modeling how a lot of those things would play out. But fortunately, when you had that assumption of 1 every single year in each little study area, they saw populations that were viable. And so that is a good indication that if, assuming that this empirical data that we are observing is somewhat accurate, and if we were to double that, we likely aren't looking at anything that'd be that extreme within those small study areas. So while it's not the work that they're describing is accurate for that focal area, but it's getting way too much traction. It's being thrown around to say that this is the case range-wide, and that's absolutely not the case.
And we don't know what range-wide is.
Correct. This is, Chair Finley, Commissioner Woolley, sounds lame, but this is an exciting time in the martin and fisher world. I understand that you heard some updates for some martin and fisher work yesterday on your tour. And so we're constantly filling in the gaps. Even as one new publication comes out, it's already outdated because there's certain ideas or assumptions that have been corrected. We've had authors kind of do a 180 in some of their public comments when they thought that things were isolated, and now they're arguing that they're potentially connected because of the new detections. They're all within a dispersal distance of each other. So this is a very fluid, not only the genetics is very fluid, just the understanding of range distribution is still very fluid.
Okay.
Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Hold on. Mr. Chair, I'm still going. So the petitioners are claiming that they didn't receive notice or consultation on the proposed rulemaking. You mentioned certain entities that were involved in public involvement. You mentioned other interested parties, in quotes. So I just wanted to just circle back on your public involvement and your outreach. Were those groups involved or excluded or what?
Chair Finley, Commissioner Woolley, certainly there's been a lot of public comment received over basically the last 2 years. So we certainly heard feedback, obviously, when we received the petition, and then in that August commission meeting, and then obviously in the December lawsuit, which we heard a great deal more information. On August 1st, I sent an email to Nick Cady with Cascadia Wildlands. Nick was our primary source of contact for this petition. The petition came from Nick, the lawsuit came from Nick, and so I sent him an email with our filing notice with these proposed rules on August 1st and suggested he contact me if you had any questions.
Okay, that's all for now.
Commissioner Zarnowitz.
I have I guess a comment that I watched Dwayne Jackson's Martin study presentation, and he's able to gather a lot of information about martins from those hair traps, the box traps where they collect the hair. And yes, that won't give maybe a complete DNA analysis, but that seems like a more benign way of getting information. I'm not opposed to trapping. I just want everybody to not start getting worried. But I agree with Commissioner Woolley that this is an isolated population, regardless if we don't know much about it at this point in time. We need to get more information, but I think at this point in time, we need to figure out a way, perhaps not to stop trapping at all, because obviously we have an endangered species in the dunes, but to definitely put a ban on trapping, not only in the dunes, but perhaps in the other portion where these martins have been found. That might not bring us more information if a trapper happens to accidentally trap a martin in one of those, in the Siskiyou, say, then they probably won't turn it into us if there's a penalty. So I don't know if there's a way to make sure that, you know, I agree that you can write up anything, any sort of wording that you want in a rule so that it's explicit about, say, what type of trap can't be used. The type of trap that might kill a martin outright, as opposed to just put a snare on its leg or something like that, where you could release it again. So I think that there's ways to protect these populations without having to ban trapping from I-5 West or ban trapping completely in the dunes or other extreme measures like that at this point in time, but still gather information through encouraging these traps where you can get DNA information and start studying this population more. That's a concern I have.
Commissioner Labarge.
So I just want to make sure, I heard, I think, testimony to ban all trapping, but I thought I didn't hear anybody, in fact, the trapping organization, which I thought I would hear, I didn't, but I didn't hear anybody that did not at least go as far as supporting the staff recommendation. Is that correct? Am I interpreting that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay.
Commissioner Woolley.
Just to follow up, a piece that I left out in relates to what Commissioner Zanowicz mentioned. In terms of this complications of writing some new language, I mean, we have some of the smartest and most capable staff, I think, anywhere in this occupation, and I brag on all of you all the time. And so I don't think that that's an impediment to writing language, describing the traps, providing the drawings like you did, writing a proposed rule. I don't think that's a very difficult thing. What was the other thing? Oh, also, I feel like we can get DNA samples without killing marten. Right? We can do live trapping and we can get DNA samples and get the same data. So I don't think we don't have to kill them to do that. So.
Okay. Commissioner Paul.
I have a very detailed, small question, Derek. The area west of I-5 completely covers the dune area. Is that correct or not correct?
Correct.
Thank you. I think I'm ready.
Okay. You all ready for the question? For your motion? Commissioner Wall.
I would move that we ban, pardon me? I have part of that. To amend OAR Chapter 635, Divisions 050, as proposed by staff, as to petition request number 2, which is to prohibit harvest in the Oregon Dunes area, and to also adopt petition request number 3, which is to prohibit harvest west of I-5, and petition request number 3, which is to ban tree trapping in the Siskiyou and Siuslaw forests.
Okay.
I second.
So are we confusing, I think those were included in the motion.
I just can't go that fast as I'm tracking it. Let's see. I was trying to type it, but.
Right?
That one is just one.
Good. Thank you. All right, well, she'll go slower.
So let me explain first, and then I'll try again on the motion, because I'd like to get this correct. My interest is in, and just to describe why, it often comes down to this with a small population that is at risk, and I do think that's what we have in front of us, that it's, do we err on the side of protecting them, or do we gather more information? And much as I love information, I think we're never going to get perfect information. And so I would like to have us adopt all 3 of the petition requests. Okay. And so I believe that I have that done. If this is the motion, I move to amend OAR Chapter 635, Divisions 050, as proposed by staff, as to petition request number 2, which is to prohibit harvest of all mammals in the Oregon Dunes area, and to also adopt petition request number 1, which is to prohibit harvest west of I-5, and to adopt petition request number 3, which is to ban tree trapping sets in the Siskiyou and Siuslaw National Forests.
And so are you proposing, is your motion to adopt the precise language that is set out on page 11 of the petition?
I don't have that in front of me. And if you have advice on that, if there's something wrong with doing it that way, you can tell me. But
The petition.
My purpose is in doing it.
Precise language, so if this is it, and then we all know we're talking about the same thing. That's the petition.
I've been looking at the summary of it.
Okay, so this is in everyone's packets, it's attachment 3 for this agenda item, and I'm looking at the language on page 11. The part I'm confused on is that you moved to amend the rule, as proposed by staff. Okay, I got it. 'Cause- yes, okay.
Okay, so you've modified your motion. Greg, are you ready to second it again?
Yes, I second that motion.
Okay, so we have a motion on the table, and moved and seconded. Further discussion?
Yeah, let's define that motion, please. A little more definitive. It's pretty large.
To ban it.
So,
Ban it.
Commissioner Wall, if you're comfortable simplifying your motion to say that you move to adopt the rule language proposed by the petitioners, which is set out on page 11 of the petition, that is a simplified motion with specific language that is in the materials in the record. And
And I am comfortable doing it that way.
So you're amending your motion. Greg? You second?
Yes, I second that.
Okay.
I agree to simplify it. It's pretty much identical to what's in the petition, so make
Jim, do
it,
you have the page that you
make it
can
easy.
read?
Yeah, I've got it, but I was looking at the stuff we received through the mail. It says, so as far as the options that we received, it says option 2, amend staff recommendations. So are we picking 1, 2, or 3, or it sounded like Mary put it in back. You only 1, 2, 3. Okay. I just want to make sure what I'm voting on, I've got it right.
All right, yeah,
So
Commissioner.
just for clarification, I want to make sure I understand. So is it essentially to ban all marten trapping west of I-5? Okay.
Yeah.
Banned a way of trapping.
Yes, the tree trapping.
Can't use
tree
any
trap
traps or
sets.
snares suspended in trees in the Siskiyou.
Hunting is still allowed in the Oregon dunes. That's what this one says.
Specific to trapping.
Yeah, it's just specific to trapping. So they can still hunt bobcat, raccoon, and the rest of them. Not trap. No, I'm talking about in the dunes.
Commissioner Spelbrink.
One thing I heard, from Derek was that very likely banning trapping in the dunes may actually have a detrimental effect. Is that right? Because some of the species like bobcat and I can remember what else it was, actually may prey on the marten as far as, so this may actually have a detrimental effect by banning trapping.
But they can still hunt them.
Can I just comment on that? So yeah, so bobcat, red fox, bald eagles, occasionally prey on marten. But human beings are far and away the largest predator on marten.
I guess I don't see that in the numbers in the tape, but.
No, that's just other research.
Okay, I'd like to call the question. All in favor of the motion as seconded, indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Nay. 2 nays.
3, I believe.
3 nays?
Who were the nays, so that we can have,
Spelbrink and Lathard.
Okay. So the motion carries 4-3. Thank you, Derek. Have you all looked at the 2020 meeting dates that are in the book? I'll give you a little grace period if you need to have your calendar at home or do some research. Commissioners Arnold,
Our, the locations aren't determined yet, okay.
done those other topics. This is to meet our geographic requirement for living in each congressional district. Eastern Oregon. All right, let's see. I think that's it. Thank you all. Adjourned. I gave them a little grace just when they get home, so let's give them, can you do 5 days?
You'll see, she sent a picture. Yeah, okay. Yeah, they're just, yeah.
Same with the app.
Yeah, however you piece it together, you've got the as long as their base has like an actual conversation, it's like talking.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, not just to me, but
Kyle's working his way over. That's
Yeah, as long as they understand that, like, the prohibit, where it applies, almost, it gets long enough, it's like, think about
I can understand that.
so,
So you can say prohibit, the next one you could say ban. Yeah. Yeah, traffic. National recreation areas, we're gonna do this national. As well as placing traffic. Yeah. You what? Okay. Okay, oh, that's right, you're staying here.